I'm both pleased and honored to be delivering this lecture series. The series is based on papers available to at least some of you, should you be interested in more detail. Philosophy is an international field, and I'm delighted to be part of the growing exchange of ideas between American philosophers and Polish philosophers. Here, I want to say that I'm especially grateful for being able to speak to you in English, and I admire the mastery of English on the part of so many of you. I have found Polish increasingly a beautiful language, and I'm sorry I can't speak in it myself. Now, what I'm going to do in this series is present the papers as best I can, rather briefly and conversationally, from the outlines. This will mean you will have less than the content of the papers, but in some cases perhaps more. I may be able to say something better than I've said in the papers, who knows? And I will also be vulnerable to formulations that are mistaken by being so informal, but I think the communication will be better. So I think what I will do is stand with the idea that I can be heard better in the back without using too loud an intonation, and I assume everyone in the back row is hearing me easily now. Good. Well then, let me begin. Part 1 is on targets of explanation. These are roughly the things that metaphorically explanation aims at. So let's talk about some common varieties of explanation, and I assume that whether there are exact translations in Polish of the terms I use, there is commonality, whether or not there are exact translations. Let me begin with explaining why. So imagine someone asking, why does she have that rash on her hand? The explanation might be because of exposure to poison ivy, which may exist in Poland. It's a vine to which many people have a serious skin allergy. Now, explanations why can be cast in the form of because statements. So there's a use of because in which the terms flanking it express elements of explanation. For ease of discussion, usually in the literature of the philosophy of science, we talk about the explanans as the explaining element and the explanandum as the thing explained. So if we say she has a rash on her hand because of exposure to poison ivy, then the explanandum is she has a rash on her hand, and the explanans is she was exposed to poison ivy. We can of course spell these out in more detail, but that's the basic idea. Now there's also explaining what, and this comes in different categories. There is the constitutional case, explaining what a certain white powder is. It's arsenic, you know, which is a poison. Explaining what he is doing when he is burning what is left of a harvested field. You're puzzled. Why is this field on fire? Well, he is preparing for next year's crop. So we redescribe what is being done in a way that makes it understandable. There are conceptual cases. What is an explanation? And there are semantic cases. What is a laparoscope? Well, you really just want to know the meaning of the word laparoscope, which designates a viewing instrument for the interior of the abdomen, something that physicians use. There's also explaining how. You can explain how to carve a leg of lamb, how to ride a bicycle. And you can do it demonstratively by showing, or you can do it verbally. But often when you do it verbally, you are explaining how the thing is done, which is a little different from explaining how to do it. In English anyway, these are two different cases. So I call them demonstrative and propositional. There is also explaining who. So you might ask who that inquisitive fellow is. And I might say, well, he's the organizer and has to ask everybody a lot of questions to be ready to introduce people. And you can explain who by giving a context, specifying a role, identifying an occasion when you met the person so you will remember the details. All right, so these are preliminaries in part 1. Let me pass to part 2, which is on epistemological, ontological, and pragmatic aspects of explanation. Now, I think that explanation why is factive. And an explanation can be singly or doubly factive. So take P because Q, as in the case of she has a rash because she was exposed to poison ivy. I think you have double factivity here. If it's true that P because Q, and that's an explanation, both P and Q are true. If only one had to be true, we would say explanation why is singly factive, not doubly. Now, I am inclined to think the best understanding of the things that explain and the things that are explained is to take them to be true propositions. But you could also say we explain facts by citing other facts. So a fact is expressed by a true proposition, though it isn't ontically exactly the same thing. Now, there is an exception to the factivity condition, and it is inference to the best explanation. So someone might say, what is that rumbling? It's nighttime and there is a distressing rumbling sound. And the answer might be, well, the best explanation is thunder. I don't think it's cannon fire. Well, the best explanation might be that thunder is causing that sound, even if the best explanation is mistaken. So when we make inferences to the best explanation, we have single factivity. You don't make an inference to the best explanation of P unless P is true, but the thing you cite as the best explanation may not be true. It's the best candidate for providing an understanding. Now, what about explaining why and knowing why? If you know why something occurred, you have explanational knowledge. If you have explanational knowledge, you are in a position to explain, but knowing why something is the case doesn't entail giving an explanation. Now, suppose you give an explanation of why P is the case. Does it follow that you know why P is the case? Well, an attentive child can hear Mama explain why P by citing Q, and hearing someone ask why P can say, oh, Q is why. But the child does not know. The child is just repeating what was heard and is on the way to knowledge, but hasn't yet arrived at it. Now, explanations, I think, are individuated finely. So we decide when two explanations, maybe both in English or one in English and one in Polish, are the same by seeing whether the content is the same in a very strict sense. So maybe we want to know why Anne brought her older brother to the party. We're surprised. We thought she would bring her fiancé, maybe. Well, explaining why she brought her older brother is the same as explaining why she brought her older male sibling, because male sibling and brother are synonymous. So strictly, there must be just one phenomenon there. But suppose we consider the fact that she brought her only brother. Well, her only brother may happen to be her older brother, but the fact that she brought her only brother is a different fact from the fact that she brought her older brother. Now, this figures importantly in understanding certain things about human action, and in understanding what we're talking about when we talk about an explanation. So I will, at least indirectly, make use of the point that explanations are individuated very finely. Now, so far I've been talking about explanations as propositional, so they're abstract. They could be expressed in English, in Polish, in some other language. But there is the giving of an explanation, which is a speech act. And when we talk about human acts and the relation between concepts and their users, we're in the pragmatic domain, the domain of practice, roughly speaking. Now, here, it's useful to ask about the connection between explanation and understanding. When I explain something, I hope that those listening get some understanding. But of course, creating understanding is a matter of causing someone to go into a certain mental state, and you can give a very good explanation in terms of saying truly why something is so, while the audience just doesn't get any understanding. So I think what we have to say is that an explanation creates the possibility of understanding, but it doesn't have to create understanding on the part of someone who receives it. Even someone who receives it understanding the words in which it is given. If you like, we could say, if you understand an explanation in the right way, you do get understanding. But if you merely understand the explanatory words, you may not get understanding. So, one way to look at all this is to say that understanding in the deep sense is partly constituted by knowing why. I don't think it's wholly constituted by knowing why, though there may be people who think that is so. Certainly if you know why something occurs, you can explain why it occurs. But perhaps explanation isn't always possible given understanding. That certainly applies to languages. You understand Polish, but can you explain Polish to me? Some of it has been explained to me, and I'm learning. But I dare say there are many here who are better at understanding it than at explaining it. All right. Now, part 3 is on explanations why. Explanations why may have a kind of primacy in the theory of explanation. We want to know why things occur, and in knowing why things occur, we often get information, or have information, that enables us to predict and to approach control. And as a matter of the way we human beings relate to the world, we want to be able to predict and control, as with the weather, for example. Now, there's a long tradition insisting that explanations why are tied to laws. So there are outlines. So if you think of David Hume, he thought that when you have a causal relation that carries explanatory power, there's always a background law. The idea in the 20th century came to be called the covering law theory of explanation. So if you explain why she got a rash by saying she was exposed to poison ivy, implicitly you are depending on a covering law that might go like this. Whenever someone of a certain skin type is exposed to poison ivy without protection, then there is a rash. And an argument for the covering law view would be that if I offer the explanation, she was exposed to poison ivy, you might say, but look, she's been exposed to it many, many times before and hasn't gotten poison ivy, hasn't gotten the rash. Or you could say, well, but lots of people don't get a rash when exposed to poison ivy, and now I'm challenged. I've got to provide the right law. Well, the usual view is that if one event causes another, there exists a law that'll have the form all F's are G's, or F's tend to be G's, and the cause is an F and the effect is a G. But you can sometimes tell that one thing causes another when you can't formulate the law. So our knowledge of causal relations sometimes precedes our knowledge of laws. And one question here is whether, if there are causal relations and genuine causal explanations, then there must be universal laws, laws of the form all F's are G's, as opposed to F's tend to be G's, where they need not be G's. Hume thought that all genuine laws are universal, exceptionless, and many take that view, but we seem to be pretty well convinced from developments in physics that the basic laws of nature are not universal. The basic laws are, or some of them are, statistical. So they'll have the form, given that an event has property F, the probability that it will have property G is such and such, or it's within a certain range. Now, must explanation be deductive? One might think if you don't have a deductive explanation, you don't really have a good understanding, because after all, if you say she got poison ivy, the rash, because of exposure, but some people are exposed and don't get it, we can wonder why she wasn't one of the exceptions. Or a person may be exposed and not get it some of the time and get it at other times. How can you have a real explanation when you have exceptions? There's an epistemology here as well. Can you know that something is so if, given your evidence, it's only probable? Think about it. You buy a lottery ticket. The probability of winning is very small, but do you know you won't win? You're in the same position as the person with the winning ticket. And it can't be the case that everyone in the position you're in knows he or she is going to lose, because someone is going to win. So now, if that's right, you can make the probability very high and not know. But, as I was saying, if you explain P by citing Q, presumably Q enables you to know why P. Well, how can you know why P on the basis of Q if Q doesn't entail P, if there's a possibility of not P given Q? This is difficult, isn't it? I want to say that there can be inductive, non-deductive explanations, so that you do not need a universal covering law. Now, how would one rationalize that? Well, partly by example. It simply is correct that sometimes you know why something occurred, even though in similar circumstances the phenomenon doesn't occur. A car that goes around a curve too fast slides off the road. Well, does every car that goes by at a certain speed slide off? Well, you might say every car like that will, unless driven by a better person. But how precise do we have to be to get an understanding? And this is, of course, a very simple case. So if you go to elementary particles, there is a sense of having understanding. But of course, I'm going to come now in a moment to action theory, and when it comes to human actions, we have paradigms of understanding in terms of purpose and intention, and yet we do not have entailment relations that enable us to formulate universal covering laws. So unless we want to give up some very important ideas about explanation, I think we have to countenance explanation that is not deductive in structure. Now, one way to see why the demand for deductive explanation is too strict is to think about the difference between a contrastive explanation and contrastiveness of explanations. So let me give you an example. A contrastive explanation is an explanation of why P rather than Q. So the thing explained has a contrast built into it. So why did she get a rash rather than an itch? I want to explain the phenomenon of a rash instead of an itch. So I'm explaining a contrast. That's fine. But not every explanation is of a contrast, even if the background in which explanation is needed always involves a contrast. So we might say, given that her twin sister was exposed and did not get the rash, why did she get the rash? Now here, we still want to explain why she got the rash, but we want some way of understanding that will enable us to contrast her with her sister. But it's not the case that we must rule out every other possibility. For instance, getting an itch instead of a rash, dying instead of getting a rash, and so on. Once again, though, the skeptic will always say, and the skeptic is pervasive in the area of thought, not just in philosophy, the skeptic will always say, if you have evidence that does not entail the truth of the conclusion, then you don't know the conclusion. Now, come to think of it, I am here among many on a law faculty. Well, we talk about the presumption of a certain thing. We talk about proof beyond reasonable doubt, and so on. Now, the skeptic is going to say, you never have proof if you don't have a valid deductive argument. But in practice, where the evidence is overwhelmingly good, we're willing to talk about proof. And we're certainly willing to talk about knowledge even where we don't have proof. So, strictly speaking, I don't have any proof that when I release this it will fall to my hand. But I think I knew that when I was to release it, it would fall. So much for examples. Now, am I proceeding too slowly or too quickly? Is this pace about right? You're able to...
At a good pace.
A little fast?
No, it's a good pace.
Okay, that's fine. Very good. I want to proceed fairly fast so we have plenty of discussion time, but not so fast that you can't see the basic movement. All right, I have given you a sense of what kinds of explanations there are, emphasized that explaining why has a special status, talked about its factivity, talked about its individuation, some of the pragmatic aspects. I've considered the connection between explanation and understanding, and I've considered the connection between explanations and laws, expressing sympathy for the idea that when you explain an empirical phenomenon, there is a law presupposed, but you don't have to be able to formulate it. Secondly, the law does not have to be universal in form. One more point, which is implicit in what I've said already. When you cite the cause of a phenomenon, you have provided information that promises that there is an explanation, but you may not have actually given an explanation. So you could say the cause of a disease is a virus, but that doesn't really explain why the person has the disease, does it? But if the cause is a virus, presumably there is an explanation were we to know enough about the kind of virus and the kind of disease. Now, that means that causes, when properly described, may be explainers. But there are ways to describe causes in which they don't give much understanding and don't automatically explain. But a simple idea is that where there is a cause, there genuinely is a cause, there is a because. So roughly, we may not be able to give the because statement, which is an explanation, but if we know that there's a cause, we should think it reasonable to search for a because statement, an explanation, if the matter is important enough. Let me then move to part 4 on explanations of human behavior. Here we're in the domain of what is commonly called action theory. Now, there is a real question, what constitutes action? Wittgenstein, the Austrian, later English philosopher, asked a question that has become famous. You could call it the subtraction question. He asked, what is left over if you subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? So, look, here you see the same rising of the arm, but this is the action of raising the left arm, and this is just the movement of the left arm's rising. Of course, I'm still raising it, but not in the same way. All right. Now, the classical answer to that question is roughly this: mental causation. A decision causes this action as an illustration, whereas an external force causes the same movement you see. And of course, the movement could be caused by a pulley with invisible strings. So that's the subtraction question. So what then is action? Well, a simple way to view action as against mere movement or behavior is this: action is doing, or roughly behavior, that has a description under which it is intentional. So, among the things we're doing right now is heating up the room. I hope not excessively. Okay, now why is that action? Because it has a description, namely talking, under which it is intentional. Certainly I am intentionally talking. So, heating up the room when you're merely in the room is not an action. But heating up the room when you're doing something that has that correct description is an action. Now, this way of talking about action presumes that actions are events, and that events are things that can be described in different ways. I call them dependent particulars. This is a hand movement, it is an illustrating, it is a display of 5 fingers. There are many ways to describe a single event. What is the event intrinsically? That's a little like asking what a substance is intrinsically. That's the old metaphysical question, what the substratum is that bears properties. Neither question about substances or about events is easy. But it seems to me that we probably should talk about events as things that have multiple descriptions. They are realities, but an event is dependent in a way a substance is not. So, for instance, there has to be an agent for there to be an action. But there could be an agent who is actionless. Now, I want to talk about intention for a moment, because it's common to think that everything you do intentionally, you do with an intention. That's not quite right, it seems to me. What you do intentionally, you do roughly for a reason, with some kind of aim. In English, the best way to put it, I think, is in order to bring something about. But it isn't true that you must have an intention as opposed to, say, a hope. So imagine that I aim at a target knowing I have a very small chance of hitting it. I hope now to hit it, but I don't intend to hit it. Intending carries, at least as the term is used in English, a level of confidence that goes beyond the confidence level required for hope. But what you do with a hope of success can be intentional, just as what you do with an intention of success is intentional. So what I think we should say is that action is rooted in intentionality, but it doesn't have to be rooted in intention. Now, it's an interesting question whether in Polish it's as easy to make the same point, but I'm sure the point is broadly translatable. Now, in any case, intentionality is a matter of mentality. It's a matter of intentions, but also desires, hopes, beliefs, judgments, expectations. So those things had better be causally efficacious. They had better have effects in the agency of you and me, if there is any action at all. So one of the things I'm concerned about when I get to part 5 on mental causation is whether there really is any such thing. Because if there isn't any mental causation, then there aren't any actions. And you and I merely behave. We don't really act. If we don't really act, what happens to moral responsibility? What do we say about rationality in persons? So I'm very concerned to defend the idea that there is genuine mental causation and to reconcile that idea with a scientific outlook on the world that allows psychology to make whatever progress it will. You can judge how well that actually works. All right, so I want to make one more point on reasons, which are a subject of a huge amount of discussion now in the literature of both ethics and philosophy of mind. There was a time when in England there was, perhaps following certain readings of Wittgenstein, a series of what we call little red books. They were published by Routledge, and in a series in which people who'd been reading Wittgenstein and thinking about action and reason brought their ideas to bear on intentionality, free will, the understanding of the social sciences. Okay. And there was a time when it was argued that reasons are not causes. Now we need to think about that. After all, if my reason for doing something is a desire to please my friends, it looks as though my reason is a psychological entity and can be a cause, in that psychological entities can be causes of action. They set us in motion. My decision to give an illustration is surely a cause of my doing this. Well, I have a device here that I think clears matters up. There are reasons and reason states. So imagine this. Someone asks, why did he drive rather than take a plane, which is so much faster and more convenient? What was his reason? And the answer is, he had too much luggage. Okay, so here the reason is a proposition, and that proposition is his reason because he believed it. Now if you ask him why, well, let's say you ask him, what was your reason for taking a car rather than a plane? He'd say, I had too much luggage. But suppose he isn't so sure he had too much luggage. Then he would say, I believed I had too much luggage. Now, very briefly, the reason is the content of a propositional attitude, like a belief or a desire. A reason state is the propositional attitude, the psychological entity that has that content. And sometimes, when you're asked for a reason, you say, I believed that, or I wanted, etc. Sometimes you just give the content of the belief, I had too much luggage, or the content of the desire, to please him. Why did you do it? To please him. Why did you bring flowers? To please her. That's the content of my desire. So, no one thinks that contents as propositions are causes. But lots of people think that the psychological states, the reason states that have those contents, are causes. So the simple thing to say is, certainly reason states can have causal power, but reasons as contents of those states do not. And what we can also say is that reasons as contents play a justificatory or a rationalizing role for the type of action explained, and reason states as psychological entities play an explanatory role for the type of action, the token of the action, the concrete thing, the event that needs to be explained. So that is the broad picture that I'm working with when I go to the question in Part 5 on the problem of mental causation. Now, here I want to mention a relation that is stronger than supervenience, which I think many of you have run into in the literature. There's been quite a bit of literature on the idea that the mental supervenes on the physical, and I'll talk tomorrow about the normative supervening on the natural. Now, supervenience is simply a relation between types of properties, such that when things at the base level, the subvenient level, are alike, they will be alike at the supervening level. So, if liking her well God duplicates someone, she will have, we think, the same psychological properties as the person of whom she is a duplicate. And if there is such a thing as a person duplicating machine, you'll have identical mental properties on the part of the duplicate, who will think herself to be the original, and then find out that it isn't true if the original still exists, or so we suppose. You may think this is just science fiction, but let's take it now to the scientific case. It is commonly supposed that you are dependent on your brain for your thoughts, and that if your brain were perfectly duplicated, then the thoughts would be perfectly duplicated as well. That's the supervenience idea. Now, that doesn't tell you anything about causal relations or explanations, but generally people who think there's supervenience of the mental on the physical also think that the mental is consequential on or resultant from the physical. So, presumably, not only is there a neural process underlying this action, but the intention to give this illustration is dependent on and consequential from a neural process. If that's true, then we have to ask, what independent causal power, or indeed explanatory power, does the mental really have? And that, of course, is connected with the question whether our idea of human beings as rational and as having moral responsibility, moral agency, dignity, whether that idea can be sustained in the face of the increasingly biological conception of the human person, which is emerging in a number of the sciences. That's really the problem I'm looking at. Now, the idea that mental properties are determined by neural properties or some kind of biological property does not entail that mental properties are identical with those properties. It's very important to see that. Even if they were identical, it doesn't follow that the mind is the brain. The idea that the mind is the brain is crude. A materialist who is extremely rigorous does not have to hold anything that crude. I was amazed that the Australian philosopher David Armstrong was willing to accept that as a sort of summary of one of his views, because he isn't really committed to that view, even though he is very much an Australian materialist. We can talk about that later if you want. But I think the idea that the mind is the brain won't go very far at all. It is not entailed by the idea that every mental phenomenon is a brain phenomenon. And even that is not entailed by the idea that there is a dependence of the mental on the physical. That dependence idea seems plausible, and because it's plausible, we worry about how, given its dependence on the physical, the mental can have any causal power in its own right. So that is the problem I'm working on here. I take it everybody sees the problem. Now, one thing you could say is, well, the causal power of the mental is real, but it's inherited. So it's a little like this. My intention to give an illustration couldn't result in this physical movement if it didn't depend on a brain process and have an appropriate connection with it. But that doesn't mean the intention has no power. So it has inherited power, but what you inherit, you at least possess. So although there's a dependence of the mental on the physical, the mental still has power. That would be, I think, a plausible idea. Now, that is anti-Cartesian, in that I think Descartes would say your desire to give an illustration could cause the action regardless of what's going on physically, although he did say the pineal gland plays some role. But I don't think the pineal gland is any more than a contingent requirement. Now, I ought to say It is not an a priori truth that the mental depends on the physical, and Cartesianism is not, in my view, a priori false. Cartesianism a priori could be true. I don't think it's been refuted. But note there are two things about Cartesianism. The substance dualist idea that you and I are a kind of unity of body and soul, but there are two different substances, and the core of persons is the soul. That's substance dualism. But then there's also the idea that a mental property is not identical with any physical property. That idea is Cartesian, but it doesn't depend on substance dualism. You and I could be broadly biological in composition, but we could have two kinds of properties, purely physical properties and mental properties, which are not reducible to physical properties but depend on them. Now, some people, most famously Jaegwon Kim, think that really if you have the dependence we think exists between the mental and the physical, then you better identify the mental with the physical, at least if the mental is supposed to do any work. If it really is physical, if there are two vocabularies but only one reality, now we understand how the mental has causal power because it's really physical. Well, that's a possible view, of course, a view widely held. The view is incidentally compatible with theism, though it is not the most comfortable view for theists to hold. Now, I'll just mention in passing that you could hold that all the causal work done in the world is done by something physical, but there exist mental phenomena which are, as philosophers put it, epiphenomenal. That is, they are products of something physical, but they have no causal power of their own. So causal power can extinguish in the sense that when a cause that's physical produces a mental phenomenon, it produces something that has no effect. So the causal chain terminates in this mental phenomenon. This is a view a little like solipsism. It's on the map, and sometimes we attribute it to others. But I don't know of anyone who really defends the view. Nonetheless, it has to be on the table for clarity. I'm not entertaining that view here. Now, in 5b, I talk about the explanatory role of mental content. And here what I do is look at the problem from the other direction, that is, the direction from the physical to the mental rather than the other way around. If the mental is dependent on and consequential on the physical, then you have your mental properties because you have your physical properties. But what if the relation is very strong, as it seems to be, at least a nomic relation, meaning it's one that holds by laws of nature. It's certainly not an accidental relation. It might even be a metaphysical relation. We know it isn't a priori. No one holds that, and it isn't plausible. But it's a strong relation. So my brain event, which represents and brings about the decision to give this illustration, if it really is a mental event, must have the content that my decision has, or if it is simply the basis of a mental event, it implies that content. Now maybe the brain event couldn't bring about this rather than some other action unless it had the content give a visible illustration or something of the sort. So perhaps physical events that do yield action do so only because they have in effect the same content as the mental event which they undergird, which they support. In making this plausible, I want to indicate that causation isn't always dynamic. The model of causation which is most popular is one in which events are the paradigm causes and effects. At least in English, causal language is most comfortable when we're talking about events. So my releasing the pen causes it to fall. The releasing is an event, the falling is an event. That's dynamic causation. But I am holding up the pen. There is a causal relation between my hand and the pen. It's sustaining causation. There's a causal relation between an engine pulling a train and the train's moving. And although you have motions here, there's a steadiness. The table is sustaining the bottle, and now there's no motion at all involved. So sustaining causation is different from dynamic causation. And mental phenomena often sustain and cause in that fashion rather than bring about at a moment. So if you ask, why is he working so late at night? One answer would be, he is determined to meet the deadline. So the determination is a kind of desire, and that sustains an activity, but the desire is not an event. And there doesn't have to be anything going on in consciousness for his strong desire to be operative in behavior. This brings me to the idea of guidance. Guidance can be very subtle, and it can exhibit a certain kind of automaticity, automaticness. You're walking in the woods, you're talking, but you step over logs that are in your way on the path. Now, your perception and any belief that may be formed guides your behavior, but although it guides it, it isn't the generative cause. And as you navigate, you're guided by your mental life, even if what's going on in the forefront of consciousness, dominating your attention, is the conversation. So very, very roughly, it looks as though the mind can process information received through perception even when consciousness doesn't deliver events that give you event causation of the behavior that is explained in part by the mental elements whose content guides behavior around obstacles. Now, all of this goes with the idea that the physical is an enabler of mental causation. Mental causation wouldn't produce action if there weren't anything physical that goes with the mental and connects with the body, whose movements actually carry out the purposes of the mind. But enabling is not doing the whole job. Enabling is making the job possible, but other elements such as intention, belief, commitment, get the actual behavioral job done. Okay, I come now to the final part, and I'll be as brief as I can here. And this is on causes, causal explanation, and mentalistic explanation. I've talked about causation as a relation between events, or maybe between states, such as the solidity of my hand and the steadiness of a pen resting on it. And here you're talking about a relation between dependent particulars. But explanation, remember I've said, is a relation between propositions, one of which, the explanandum, which can be a set of propositions, explains the explanandum, the thing explained, the proposition that describes the fact to be explained. So these two relations must not be confused. And I've said that when you know there's a cause, you have a promise of an explanation, but knowing that there's a cause and an effect doesn't automatically tell you what the explanation is. And there may be more than one connected with that cause and effect. Now, as I see it, the causal power of the mental involves the possibility that citing a mental phenomenon can causally explain a phenomenon that's partly physical, namely the action. This action is physical in that its base is a movement in the physical world, but given that it is purposive, it has a mentalistic element about it. It has a description under which it is giving an illustration, intentionally communicating something. Now, you might worry about this, and here I come to the idea that the world might be causally closed. This is an idea suggested by Jaegwon Kim, who is attracted to materialism about the mental as an account of how the mental is causally efficacious. Presumably, a world that's physically just like this will be mentally just like this. That is, if you like, a macrocosmic, a very large-scale version of the idea that a perfect duplicate of a human person will have the same psychological properties. Now, if you think that this is true, you might think that every event that can be explained at all can be explained in terms of some physical event. And to get an explanation of an event, you never have to go outside the physical world. So the physical world, which determines the mental world, is causally closed. Now, this view would be anti-theistic, or at least it seems to be anti-theistic, and it would also suggest that the mental by itself has no causal power. The views are associated. You could separate them, but they're closely associated. Now, I think there's a triple ambiguity in the idea that the mental lacks causal power. So I expose that and then can arrive at a general conclusion. One idea would be that mental events have causal power only if they have a description under which they're physical. Now let's think about that a minute. So the mental event deciding to give an illustration can have causal power only if the mental event is also a physical event. Well, how about this? The mental event is a decision which has a content to give an illustration, but that decision can be the same thing as a brain event in terms of the token, the particular. Remember, I'm treating events as dependent particulars that can bear different descriptions, just as a substance can be at once a bottle, a piece of plastic, a subject of illustration. So you could look at it this way. This is now called token physicalism. Mental events can have an identity with physical events at the level of the particular, even though mental properties are not physical properties. So that's called token physicalism, as against type physicalism, which says the mental properties are the same as the physical properties. So if this is what's meant by the idea that a mental event has causal power only if it has a physical description, well, all right, so what? Presumably mental events do have physical descriptions. There's something going on in the brain. We don't have to say that the mental is reducible to the physical just because whenever the mental occurs, there's something you could also describe in physical terms. That's point one. So that's something we can deal with. The second understanding of the idea that the mental as such has no causal power might go like this. Any law of nature linking a mental event to any other event depends on the physical properties involved. Okay, let's think about that. Maybe my considering the proposition that all humans are mortal and the proposition that Socrates is human wouldn't cause me to believe that Socrates is mortal unless there were a relation between the brain events that go with the premises, the thought of the premises, and the brain events that go with the thought of the conclusion. That might be all right. That's in a way to say there's a dependence, and the brain events enable the mental events to connect in a law-like way. but it doesn't say the mental events have no causal power at all, and it seems to me we can live with that if we have to. But notice that causes don't entail that there are universal laws, and maybe they don't even entail that there are laws. I've said I'm sympathetic with the idea that there are causal relations only when there are background laws, but that isn't an obvious truth, so someone could deny that. But the third reading is damaging to the view I hold. On the third reading of the idea that mental events in their own right have no causal power is this: citing a mental event, such as desiring to give an illustration, cannot explain anything. But that flies in the face of common sense, doesn't it? It's quite obvious that paradigms of explanation are cases in which we explain an action by citing an intention to achieve an end and a belief that doing the thing will achieve the end. I believe that raising my hand will achieve the end of giving an illustration of mental causation. I want to give an illustration, so the belief and the desire bring this about. Now, maybe they wouldn't bring it about if there weren't something going on in the brain, but surely the fact that I have that belief and desire explain the fact that I raise my hand. And we can argue about just what the underlying physical processes are, but as far as I can see, we really do here have a clear case of explanation. I think I'm ready to read just the concluding paragraph, which brings together a number of elements here, and then we'll be ready for discussion. By way of conclusion, I want to reiterate several points. First, I have contended that explanation why, the most important kind for science and probably for philosophy as well, is doubly factive, finely individuated, and essentially connected with knowledge and understanding. Second, it is plausible to conceive explaining why in relation to the possibility of laws covering the phenomenon in question, those that the explanans and explanandum concern. Third, where singular events are explained, such as just this, it is natural to posit causation, even if one does not take it to entail the existence of some covering law. Fourth, supposing that explanation why does entail the existence of some covering law, the relevant law need not be universal. You could say loosely deductive. And fifth, there is no good reason to deny that explanations why can be intentionalistic, which means they're paradigms of mental explanations in terms of mentality. Intentionalistic explanations may or may not be backed by reduction of mental properties to physical ones. If reduction is possible, however, then the reducing elements, the brain elements say, must embody the complexity of the elements reducible to them, and in that way equivalent to them. So I better just say informally, if you can reduce x to y, then even if x is nothing over and above y, y is nothing less than x. So if you could reduce the mental to the physical would have to be quite complicated to be a real candidate to reduce the mental. It would have to have content, it seems to me. If our intentional states are identical with neural states, then the relevant neural states have content and complexity far transcending their status as merely biological phenomena. I see no ultimate conflict, then, between the idea that human beings are rational agents of the kind capable of freedom and moral agency and the view that they are part of the natural world. Thank you.